Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, talks in Moscow are held between Taliban and the Afghan opposition members. They've discussed the new constitution. They've discussed women's rights, interestingly enough. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has said on Tuesday that his administration was holding constructive talks with groups in Afghanistan, including the Taliban, and would be able to reduce the U.S. troop presence and focus on counter-terrorism as it makes progress. Now, these negotiations would enable the U.S., he says, to focus on the more crucial matter that remains in Afghanistan, that is counter-terrorism. Now, after 17 years of war in Afghanistan, Trump says that the time has come to try for peace. Meanwhile, Afghanistan's defense ministry has confirmed that 8 Taliban fighters have been killed in nationwide operations in the past 48 hours. Now, let's find out more of how, first, the peace talks in Moscow. What can we conclude from this? Is there a hopeful note at which they will end? And especially the question about what Trump has said, a number of things regarding Afghanistan, especially in an important speech he gave in the State of the Union address. For that, let me start welcoming our guests here on Newswire. First and foremost, let's welcome our guest, Mr. Mushtaq Rahim, who is joining us from Hiroshima. He's a political analyst and an expert on these issues. And also with us is Dr. Vadim Kozyulin from Moscow. Welcome to the show. Let me start with you, Mr. Rahim. In reference to the talks that have taken place, once again, one of the key stakeholders was missing, which is the Afghan government. What is your take on these talks having been held without them?
Well, first of all, the absence of Afghan government shouldn't really surprise us, because it was a meeting organized as part of the Afghan community living in Moscow. Secondly, I see this gathering as part of the track 1.5 or even track 2 diplomacy for the peace process in Afghanistan. And in such kind of talks, you don't have your government representatives joining. This is more about getting to know each other, getting to talk to the different parties, and creating an environment where people can start believing that there is an opportunity to proceed further with the peace talks. So I look at it from that perspective. It was a good icebreaker, because some of the leaders met the Taliban leadership for the first time face to face. They had an opportunity to put forward their agendas, their concerns, their future vision for Afghanistan. And they had a sort of open communication where every party and every participant had an opportunity to put forth their views. For example, the Taliban talked about the amendments or even changing the constitution. We had Mr. Qanuni, the former vice president, saying that they stand for the current system, the state system that is operational. Ms. Fawzia Kofi, one of the parliament members, talked about women's rights. So that was more about getting to know each other, getting to know each other's point of views. And I think these discussions should continue in the future as well, and will be certainly contributing to the overall peace process. There was a little bit of glitch in between, that the Afghan government was not really comfortable having the Afghan politicians joining it. And that was mainly because the Taliban have been on a diplomatic process where they're trying to undermine the legitimacy of the Afghan government in order to get into the political dialogue with an upper hand and having the Afghan government under pressure. That was something that upset the Afghan government. Otherwise, such gatherings are normal as part of the peace processes. Track 1.5 and track 2 is quite known diplomacy, and these sort of gatherings usually create opportunities for advancing the peace talks to the formal negotiation level.
You mentioned that this is a good opportunity for all stakeholders to sort of get to know each other more. It's a confidence-building measure, but also can we see it as an opportunity for the opposition parties to get some headway in establishing their role in the future setup of the new Afghan government?
Well, I don't know if this is the right time to talk about new Afghan government or the current Afghan government, because there haven't been any sort of discussion vis-a-vis the future setup. The Americans have been quite clear that they will support the current democratically established government. In July, we are going to have the presidential elections. So there are no issues. People have registered and there are election tickets quite clear, known who are going to run for the office. So that's not the discussion really. What I see, President Karzai leading the rest of the group, they have mainly been trying to show and trying to create an opportunity where they can connect with the Taliban and share views. I can tell you that even President Karzai wanted to meet, former President Karzai wanted to meet current President Ashraf Ghani before he was departing for Moscow. But due to schedule issues, they couldn't meet. And I can assure you that once they are back, they'll be again talking to the Afghan government. So in that perspective, I see it more of a track to diplomacy, and I think based on that, the different influential personalities are trying to facilitate the talks process, trying to really link up the two sides and contribute towards the peace process.
But I see that you have confidence in as you said, Karzai tried to meet with Ashraf Ghani, but there is concern coming out of the Afghan people, the Afghan government, from the spokesman of the president, saying that this Moscow meeting, pretty much saying that it has no authority, no executive authority, and without the Afghan government, nothing can be decided.
Of course, that has to be the situation, and certainly this is what I'm saying, that this meeting is more about track two diplomacy. It's more about talking informally about the peace processes. It's more about discussing informally the future outlook of the Afghan peace process, etc. They don't have any authority to decide upon things.
No, but it gives across, what I'm trying to ask you is, it gives across a different sentiment altogether, as if they being not invited, once again, not being part of crucial talks, once again, has left them behind. I mean, it doesn't convey the kind of optimism that you're referring to.
See, the government has to be playing their political, they have to be doing their politics. I can tell you, I don't see this meeting more than a track to diplomacy gathering, where there is no formal talks happening. So I don't know how to put it as part of the formal process. The formal process has been between Zalmay Khalilzad and Taliban, and that also has been declared as talking for talks or pre-negotiation process, where Zalmay Khalilzad has been trying to facilitate a future negotiation between the Afghan government and the Taliban.
Moscow has always regarded Taliban as terrorists. Right now, they've held two-day talks there in Moscow. What exactly is changing in their dynamics with the Taliban, and in the future, how will this affect the region?
Well, this is not something new. The Russians have changed their policy towards the Taliban, and overall the their Afghan foreign policy has changed since the last 2 years now. They have been trying to avoid the negative and spillover effects of potential security and insecurity and instability in Afghanistan. Secondly, they're trying to negate the Americans who have been trying to keep the Russians out of the overall Afghan politics, and the foreign policy of the Americans have been to keep the Russians at a distance. Now, Russians are proactively trying to engage by reaching out to the Taliban, talking to them, talking to the politicians inside Afghanistan. Even the Afghan government, we all know that they have been quite mobile as far as the Afghan peace is concerned for the last at least 24 months, and particularly last 1 year. And that has been mainly because they want to ensure that they are part of the process when decisions are made. The decisions are made in a way which should not have a negative impact for Central Asian countries, and more particularly for Moscow itself, for Russia. So that's why they have been quite active and quite mobile in the Afghan peace process, and this is part of that whole process. And even I can tell you that my analysis is that the gathering has been supported from the back door by the Russians in order to mobilize the Afghans living in Moscow to get everybody together.
Okay. So let me ask you this, Dr. Vadim, then you're a global security expert. What, in your opinion, has changed when it comes to Moscow's policy towards Afghanistan, especially considering they have always considered Taliban as terrorists, and now they're hosting talks for the Taliban in Moscow?
Moscow official position for years was that peace will not come to Afghanistan from Washington. It will be multilateral process with engagement of all neighbor countries and all Afghani groups and forces, including opposition forces as well. And today, Russia is trying to promote this way, which opens door for all opposition forces, for government of Afghanistan, for different groups, for diasporas abroad.
But do they still consider the
together.
Taliban as terrorists?
As for Taliban, we know that Russia held certain round of talks with opposition groups, including Taliban forces. And today, Russia is regarding Taliban as one of parties which have to be included in the peace process.
So they don't consider them as terrorists anymore?
It's still included in the list of terrorist groups, but the issue is under review, and it might be that Russia will lift those sanctions imposed on Taliban.
Also, Dr. Vadim, how far does Moscow's policy get affected by the very presence of Daesh in Afghanistan?
Actually, nowadays it becomes one of key factors in Russian policy towards Afghanistan. It's commonly known that ISIS groups are withdrawing from Syria and from Iraq, and they're finding heaven in northern provinces of Afghanistan. It provokes concern among Russian military and among our neighbor countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyz Republic. Actually, Kyrgyz Republic invites Russian forces to open new base in the south of this republic just to repel this threat of ISIS, which is being expected nowadays in Central Asia. So the tension is quite high. Maybe the expectations of ISIS terrorism is a bit exaggerated, but still it's one of key issues which dominate in Russian policy towards Afghanistan today.
Okay, and here I'd like to play a video clip of President Donald Trump. He said on Tuesday that his administration was holding constructive talks with groups in Afghanistan. Let's listen to what he was saying.
I have also accelerated our negotiations to reach, if possible, a political settlement in Afghanistan. The opposing side is also very happy to be negotiating. Our troops have fought with unmatched valor, and thanks to their bravery, we are now able to pursue a possible political solution to this long and bloody conflict. In Afghanistan, my administration is holding constructive talks with a number of Afghan groups, including the Taliban. As we make progress in these negotiations, we will be able to reduce our troops' presence and focus on counterterrorism, and we will indeed focus on counterterrorism. We do not know whether we'll achieve an agreement, but we do know that after 2 decades of war, the hour has come to at least try for peace, and the other side would like to do the same thing. It's time.
So who are these groups that President Trump is referring to that also include the Taliban? Let me welcome my third guest here. We have with us Mr. Rupert Stone, who's joining us from Berlin. He's a journalist. Welcome back to the show, Mr. Stone. Just quickly referring to his speech, he mentions that his administration is talking to other groups. Who is he referring to?
Other groups, I mean, I'm not sure. He could be referring to other factions in Afghanistan. I'm not entirely clear. I mean, I didn't.
So he refers to that his administration is talking to various groups, including the Taliban. The understanding from that seems to be sort of somewhere between the lines. Let me come to you, Mr. Mushtaq Rahim. What is your interpretation of what he means when he's saying that besides the Taliban, who is this conversation taking place with?
Well, as Mr. Stone said, I'm also not clear what groups he's talking about, but definitely not the Daesh or ISIS. That's out of question. Maybe he might be referring to these different opposition groups, the political opposition of the Afghan government, because his special envoy for the Afghan peace, Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, have been meeting different political elite groups. Whenever he is in Kabul, he has been talking to those different political leaders in Kabul, and maybe that is what he means, but I'm not sure. We're just guessing right now. But as far as the groups are concerned, I think it's the Taliban, which Zalmay Khalilzad had been meeting them. Before him, Alice Wales was meeting them. The Afghan government is, of course, part of the process, and the Americans have been quite clear that it has to be between intra-Afghan dialogue as soon as we reach agreement on the major hurdles.
Okay, coming back to you, Mr. Stone, as this seems clearly there's a lot of confusion on who he is exactly referring to. It almost seems deliberate to sort of create this sort of speculation. But just trying to understand the approach of the Taliban here. They've refused to speak to anybody but the Americans, and now they're sitting with the opposition parties in Moscow. Isn't this a sort of reflective of a contradictory approach? Because they've not wanted to speak to the Afghan government at all, calling them a puppet of the U.S., but yet they're speaking to the opposition people.
I suppose you could say it's contradictory. I mean, the issue with the Afghan government, as you said, is the de facto government, but they believe it's illegitimate and it's just propped up by the U.S. military, U.S. funding. And I suppose these Afghan factions aren't, well, in some cases, they hold office, I think. But, I mean, this could be a bargaining strategy by the Taliban, that they're trying to hold out as long as possible on accepting talks with the Afghan government to try and extract concessions from the US. I mean, they clearly want the troop withdrawal to be sorted out before they go any further with talks with Kabul.
Right, and continuing on that note, if there is a troop withdrawal, a complete troop withdrawal, what do you think will be left behind, especially if we are to go back in history and see what happened after the Soviet invasion? There was a lot of embitterment, there was a lot of clashes within different ethnic tribes in Afghanistan, and complete chaos. Do you see this time being any different?
Yeah, I mean, people have talked about a return to the 1990s when, as you say, you had a lot of ethnic strife and countries piled in behind different factions, and there was really a civil war. I think it's different now for the simple reason that the Taliban has a lot more foreign support. And if you look at Iran and Russia, I mean, in the 1990s, they supported the Northern Alliance. And now they both seem to support the Taliban, I think quite clearly in the case of Iran, reportedly in the case of Russia. So I think there's a greater likelihood following a precipitous US withdrawal that the Taliban would just seize control of the country, actually. I think this talk of ethnic conflict is not really plausible.
So, Dr. Vadim, what is your take on it? How do you interpret Moscow's understanding of what would happen if U.S. troops were to withdraw? Do you see any kind of a normalcy that there would be an interim government set up, they would succeed, there would be elections, or would it be the complete opposite, chaos?
First of all, talking about Taliban, I would say that Russian attitude towards Taliban is a bit mistreated. Russia doesn't say that Moscow supports Taliban. Moscow conducts negotiations with Taliban, trying to minimize its future losses in respect of ISIS. On the other hand, Moscow also talks to other opposition groups, which generally represent Northern Alliance, Jamiat al-Islami, Ata Mohammed Noor, or Mohammed Ismail Khan. So Russia conducts negotiations with very different groups and try to find most constructive ones. Speaking about future processes in Afghanistan, which we might expect, I would say that in comparison to 1990s, they are more prepared we see international coalition of countries which are ready to invest, which are ready to cooperate in assistance to Afghanistan, economically, military. There is a common goal to have Afghanistan secure and peaceful. So I would say that there are all makings to make Afghanistan peaceful. Of course, Afghanistan is not united nowadays. It's fragmented, it's divided, and probably one of
Right.
reasons why different countries, it's about 20 countries nowadays
Right.
which
So-
talk to opposition forces. They try to find common ground for opposition. Yes, please.
Right. So, Dr. Vadim, is this Moscow endorsing that the real sort of the one force that can take on ISIS and has successfully is the Taliban right now in Afghanistan, not just the U.S. forces?
Yes, Russia expects, or at least hopes, to have certain assistance from Taliban
Right.
in neutralizing ISIS forces.
Okay, Mr. Stone, let me come back to you on this also. There is a lot of concern about what would happen, not just in terms of security in Afghanistan after U.S. withdraws, but there's also a concern, and this is something that one of the senior women activists from Afghanistan spoke about, Ms. Kufi, in these Moscow talks, was what would happen to women, that there was no way we were going back to scratch, as she said. Is it realistic to expect that Taliban, as they said that we are concerned about women's rights, as they said in their speech in Moscow, to stick to their commitment on what women's rights are? Or is this still a very gray area, because they do refer to adhering to women's rights how they are in the Sharia?
I think it is a grey area. The statements that they've made so far kind of ambiguous. I mean, Mr. Stanikzai at the Moscow event yesterday delivered a presentation, and part of it seemed to be positive. And as you say, he spoke favorably of upholding women's rights. But then later in the speech, he talked about he slammed the era of the Western occupation for bringing in depravity, moral depravity, and that a future Afghan constitution should wipe all that out. So that immediately conjured up echoes of Taliban government in the 1990s and all the most draconian practices there. I think we can get some sense of the Taliban's current attitude to these things from the aspects of the areas of Afghanistan that they now administer as a shadow government. And certainly one report, it showed that girls were going to school, but only before that there was very little secondary female education. So I really don't think we should get carried away about the Taliban's attitude to women's rights. I mean, they might have come some way forward, but I mean, they're nowhere near a kind of liberal democratic approach to these things.
Mr. Rahim, let me ask you the same question, especially considering that majority, these statistics are of course varying, majority of the area in Afghanistan comes under Taliban control, and I understand that most of these areas are rural areas. So this becomes a real concern. There, of course, women education is not something that is of priority, but in fact, it's something that is denied to women. So how can we expect that the Taliban will stick to their promise of fulfilling women's rights, as even according to the Sharia or the Quran, which does categorically say that women deserve to be educated?
First of all, let's differentiate between control and influence. Taliban have a lot of influence in rural areas, but they don't control many areas. There are numbers which can be looked at. As far as the future role is concerned, as far as the women's rights is concerned, see, many of the things have to be ironed out. For example, what sort of government setup? How are they going to engage with the Afghan government, the current institutions, the women's rights, the issue of the past legacy of the last 17 years of war? These all have to be discussed. Nothing as such has been discussed as of yet. Right now, the only discussion that formally has taken place has been about international withdrawal. that Taliban have been asking for an exact timeline from the Americans, and vice versa. The Americans have been asking them to join the negotiation with the Afghan government. The Americans have been asking for the ceasefire. Nothing formal has been discussed. Even yesterday, as I said, it was more of point of view sharing. Like Mr. Qanuni said that they want the current institutions to continue and remain as they are. The constitution can be amended, but the constitution is very good. The other way, then we have Taliban having their point of view. So there are so many things to be discussed in detail, and there has to be agreements. Once there are agreements, we will certainly have international guarantees and regional guarantees, which will compel the Taliban, and not only Taliban, but the Afghan government, the Afghan politicians, to adhere and to respect all those agreements that are reached.
I'm sorry to interrupt here, Mr. Rahim, but I feel I understand why you would be cautious and hope to see the end of these talks until you could make that. But let's be honest here. The Taliban have stuck to their demands, and they have not compromised. They are not the ones running out of time here. I mean, there is speculation that the U.S. Negotiating or trying to acknowledging the Taliban as a recognizable entity in Afghanistan. Experts are also seeing this as a U.S. sort of a fig leaf, so to speak, to withdraw from there, something that they excel on. They've done it in Vietnam, they've done it in Iraq. So, I mean, what my point right now is that the Taliban do have an upper hand here. It would be almost unrealistic to not be prepared to see them in power or a significant role to play in Afghanistan. In that context, it is a serious concern, as Fawzia Kufi did highlight, that what would happen to the progress made. Right now, urban centers in Afghanistan have almost 40% women in schools, girls in schools. So will that number go down as a result?
Look, dynamics will certainly change. The dynamics will change and again, I'm saying there are concerns. There are concerns not only about women's rights, but many other things. The future outlook of the Afghan government system, the Afghan economic system, the Afghan international relations, the foreign policy, the women's rights, and many other things. These have to be discussed on negotiation table. That's what I'm telling you. Second point is that I don't say that the Americans are not negotiating. They're certainly negotiating, and they are in a hurry because they cannot continue for any longer. But in the meantime, don't forget that the Taliban also want to negotiate. Had it been about defeating, have it been about demolishing the current regime and system, they wouldn't have gone for the negotiation table. They are sitting with them in Qatar. They are meeting the Emirs in Abu Dhabi, and they are running to Russia as well. So all sides want to reach a peaceful settlement through political dialogue. The details have to be ironed out, and it's all about diplomatic effort to have an upper hand when it comes to the formal agreements.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rahim. Sorry, that's all the time we have right now. And thank you, Mr. Stone and Dr. Vadim, for your contribution here on Newswire, talking about the future of Afghanistan as two-day peace talks come to an end in Moscow, where the Taliban have also categorically said that we are not looking for an exclusive rule in Afghanistan. And as this came when they were speaking to opposition parties of the Afghan government. Now, with that, we're going to take a quick short break, but stay tuned, because when we come back, we'll be talking more on what President Trump has said, this time regarding Syria and the situation as it unfolds there, regarding the 32-kilometer deep buffer zone that has become a sticking point between Erdogan and President Trump. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Newswire. Turkish President Erdogan says he has not yet seen an acceptable plan for the creation in Syria of a safe zone aimed at protecting Turkey's border from attack. Washington's support of the YPG in the war against Islamic State angers Ankara, which considers the militia terrorists linked to decades-long Kurdish insurgency inside Turkey. But Trump's surprise announcement of withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria, which he made in December 2018, sort of eased Turkish-U.S. tensions back then. Erdogan, however, is voicing growing frustration about a perceived lack of clarity on part of U.S. forces and U.S. policy on when they will withdraw and how they will withdraw, and also how the safety zone will be implemented. To talk more about not just Turkey and U.S.'s take on how they will make the safe zone and how they will progress, and what the situation in Syria looks like now, I would like to welcome a guest. We have a journalist from TRT World joining us from Istanbul, Mr. Resul Sardar. Welcome to the show. And also Mr. Navvar Saban. He's a researcher at Omran Center for Strategic Studies joining us from Turkey. Also, welcome to the show. Let me start with you, Mr. Resul Sardar, of what has just this conversation about the 32-kilometer safe zone continues to go back and forth between U.S. and Erdogan. Where do you think they're headed from there? It's by many analysts also called the northeastern part of Syria is called a very fluid area. What do you think is going to become of it? Who's going to end up actually establishing the safe zone?
Look, to understand the complexity of the issue, there must be a distinction, a clear distinction. Turkey is the homeland of the biggest Kurdish population on the earth. So roughly we're talking about 20 million Kurds in Turkey. And they are the citizens. They are not minorities. And according to the foundation of this state, Kurds are not the minorities. So when we talk about the Kurds in Turkey, it is a natural part of the nation. And as any Turk has the rights, Kurds also enjoy their liberties of the citizenship as much as any Turk, ethnically a Turkish one. So that is one issue. What I'm trying to say is that basically Turkey's problem is not with the Kurds, but it is with the PKK, which has been a Marxist-Leninist armed group that have killed so far 40,000 Turkish citizens. Any country, Pakistan, USA, any European countries, or any sovereign countries on the earth will definitely not like the idea of a group that has killed 40,000 of its citizens to build or to establish a kind of state-like region at their own border. So the distinction between the PKK and Kurds must be clear. As Daesh or ISIS or ISIL does not represent Islam and Muslims, PKK, according to Ankara's approach, PKK also does not represent the Kurds. That must be clear. When it comes to the safe zones, Turkey, by the end of 2014, has insisted to create a safe zone at the northern regions of Syria, especially for the refugees. You know, Turkey now is the largest host of the Syrian refugees. Roughly, we're talking about 3.6 million, and Europe also received, maybe comparing to Turkey, is a very much small number of the people, but they also have received a quite good number of the refugees and so on. But the international community did not react by that time. Recently, President of the USA, Donald Trump, has uttered that it could be a good idea to create a safe zone at the north of Syria. But for Turkey, there are the questions. Turkey is welcoming this idea, but the questions remains there. First, who is going to control these safe zones? Is the safe zone, the term safe zone, meaning the same for both parties or not? If the USA is planning to create a safe zone, that safe zone is going to be actually a kind of protection umbrella to the PKK or its Syrian option YPG. That's not going to be acceptable by Turkey. I think what Turkey is desiring for is to create a safe zone that is roughly around 20 miles, and it is controlled, or the security is being provided by Turkey and the USA itself, which I'm talking about the second largest NATO member and the largest NATO member, Turkey and the USA. If that happens, Turkey is welcoming that, and basically Turkey is asking the USA to cut its support to YPG, which is the Syrian offshoot of the PKK, and the PKK is officially on the terror list of the United Nations, European Union, and the United States of America. That's why Turkey is very much frustrated about this inconsistency of the USA administration, because on one hand, USA sees PKK as a terrorist organization, but on the other hand, PKK Syrian offshoot or Syrian branch is USA's partners on the ground. Turkey is very much frustrated about this inconsistency.
They're frustrated by this inconsistency. And Mr. Navvar, let me get your take on it also. Do you maybe see the way President Trump is behaving on this safe zone issue as well, that maybe he's backsliding on his decision to withdraw troops from Syria?
Mm-hmm. Simply, you cannot say he's backing up on his decision, but he's realizing day by day that his decision was not studied in a very accurate way. You are leaving an area this area is surrounded by Iranian militia. This area have local militia supported with the regime. You are willing to leave an area which is a very fragile security area. You do still have ISIS cell in this location. You do still have also some of the extremist PKK. So the Turkish side have all the rights to be concerned about the withdrawal of the American, and they need to speed up the procedure of the speed zone, because simply the area in eastern Syria is so much complicated. It basically can't handle any more pressure. You are talking about an area that within this area have a lot of problem. The Americans said that they were able to vanquish ISIS several months ago, but still ISIS is using now a different tactic, totally different tactic. They are using the assassination attempt. Just last month, in January, they conducted around 45 assassination. You have the security matter. We saw also explosive that targeted the American personnel. So
they've changed tactics, but what still remains a big question when it comes to U.S. and Turkey trying to figure this situation out, especially since President Trump really did not take into confidence any of his allies, especially not Turkey, about withdrawal, was that what exactly is their intention? Before I finish that question, let me quickly play something that President Trump had said in this video clip. Take a listen.
When I took office, ISIS controlled more than 20,000 square miles in Iraq and Syria just 2 years ago. Today, we have liberated virtually all of the territory from the grip of these bloodthirsty monsters. Now, as we work with our allies to destroy the remnants of ISIS, it is time to give our brave warriors in Syria a warm welcome home.
Okay, so while you heard President Trump announcing how confident he is about eliminating ISIS and how the withdrawal of troops was decided, there's something that is interesting also, that one of the top U.S. generals made a statement, was that he was not consulted on this decision that Trump made prior to the decision was made. But let's take a listen from the general's mouth himself.
General, were you aware of the president's intention to order the withdrawal of our troops from Syria before that was publicly announced?
I was not aware of the specific that announcement. Certainly, we are aware that he has expressed a desire and intent in the past to depart Iraq.
So you weren't consulted before that decision was announced?
We were not. I was not consulted.
So in front of a Congress committee, he confirmed that he was not consulted. And now this is a very senior guy. He's the commander of U.S. Central Command, which basically oversees military operations in the Middle East. And he comes out and says that we were not even consulted. So leave alone the NATO allies. But let's talk about it on a different road. And Mr. Resul, I would like to hear your version on this, that how does U.S. go about supporting terrorists that are terrorists in the eyes of Turkey, their biggest ally in NATO, and yet at the same time not acknowledging that using them to defeat ISIS in Syria is actually counterproductive for their relations with Turkey. And now they're withdrawing and at the same time having an issue how Turkey will operate behind once they leave.
Well, a good question. Normally, I wouldn't say that it's a terrorist organization only in the eyes of the Turkey. All of the American politicians are well aware of that YPG is the PKK Syrian offshoot. They all know it. But the problem with the USA's administration is that, or overall with the USA's policies, I will say, is that when USA has an ally, basically it is supposed to, the nature of the relations of the allies is supposed to be meticulously careful about each other's security concerns. But unfortunately, when it comes to the USA, it doesn't work like that. For the USA, they have their priorities, and they go with their interest without listening properly their allies' concerns. And when the allies tell the Americans that, hey, we have that kind of concerns, so let's sit and talk, they are so much politically correct and say, of course, we understand your concerns. Of course, we are going to take care of that. But they always go with what they want. And Turkey is frustrated with it. Each of the American officers, when you talk to them off the record, they know very well that YPG is PKK offshore and PKK is on their terror list. Simply, I asked many of the USA's officials, including some of their army generals, don't you really know that YPG is the PKK is offshore? They say, we know it. So, and then what is the issue? They say, because YPG is good fighting against ISIS. I don't think that's true. Because if the USA, to that extent, on the Syrian opposition, most probably Syrian opposition will be much better when it comes to fight against ISIS. Since 2014, the USA cut off its aid or weapons to the Syrian opposition and basically invested everything in YPG. Look at that. If they think that really YPG is good, in Raqqa and in many other places, you know that the city has been smashed down, literally smashed down, by the air bombardments. What was the reason? Because YPG basically told the Americans that we are not capable of having fight in the streets against ISIS, so you smash down the city, and then after that we'll go. If YPG is that much capable of fighting ISIS, then why the USA's air forces had to smash down, literally?
So what in your opinion was the reason? What do you think was the reason behind supporting YPG in the first place?
I think the reason is that American projection related to the region, because what I can see is that America wants to shift the nation states in the region into the federation, ethnic and sectarian-based federations, like in Iraq. To do that, they need YPG. They are trying to legitimize YPG and to represent it as representatives of the Kurds, because if they want to shift these nation states into the ethnic and sectarian-based nation states, they need the Kurdish card. And YPG looks like a useful tool for them. At the end game, I think that is Washington's vision related to the region. So by doing that, by creating nation states, by creating federations into the nation states, American politicians or the administration is looking for three benefits. First, not to let any central strong capital in the region that could potentially, today or tomorrow, could potentially challenge the U.S. interest in the region. And second, to create fragile political systems that whenever the Americans want, they can just touch and create the chaos. To be secured against other federation will inevitably need Washington's support. That is what I can say. Otherwise, there is no reasonable explanation why Turkey offering the USA, the Turkish troops, which is the second largest NATO army, to be on the field and having a battle against ISIS, but the USA not choosing that, on the other hand, going with YPG. I think that is the only explanation, the reasonable explanation that we could get out of Americans so far. And I have asked that to one of the American generals. Are you planning to shift the nation states in the region into ethnic and sectarian-based federations or not? He told me that, he answered me that this is not our official policy, but I can see that our policies are leading region to that end.
Yes, it couldn't be possibly an official, because this is exactly what President Trump continues to campaign about, that this is not our business, we will not fight wars for other countries, and we have to end the endless war. So it is understandable that this would be the sort of pretext behind what his actual actions are in the Middle East. But let me move back to the safe zone. Now, there is also concern that Erdogan's frustration with Trump, as it continues, he's now looking for other allies to help him establish this safe zone. And he is expected to visit Putin next month, yes?
If I'm not wrong, on the 23rd of February, there will be a summit between Iranian president, Turkish president, and Russian president, which is something that's already happening. You know that this initiation started in Astana, and then it has shifted in Sochi. The President Erdogan's frustration about the USA is that when the USA, President Trump, after having a phone call with President Erdogan, President Trump announced that the USA is going to withdraw its forces, all forces, from Syria, and it will take from 60 days to 90 days, basically maximum 3 months. Mm-hmm. And that was the plan. Then the Turkish delegation and the American delegation, they have met to work on a roadmap. But after that, lots of the American institutions, medias, and the lobby groups and so on, they started to pressure over Trump that this is not a good idea because it was basically against the projection of shifting the nation states into the federations. And then the USA's administration started to talk about different dates, not talking about a certain schedule or calendar related to the withdrawal. Turkey thought that, they're trying to gain the time, and it is not going to happen maybe, but just as they're trying to keep Turkey calm down, and that is frustrating. That is very much frustrating for Turkey. So Turkey is asking the USA to come up with a clear withdrawal plan that has some deadlines. It should not be an open-ended process. Because when it's an open-ended process, it will take years and years, and the PKK Syrian offshore is going to cement its presence in that region. And a couple of years later, it's going to be much more costly for Turkey to somehow swap that group in that region. So that is something that the USA must understand. Look, just a question. How would American politicians feel if Turkey directly and openly support a fraction of Al-Qaeda in any part of the world? What will be the reaction of the USA?
That's very important. That is a very good point to make. But since we are running out of time, and I hate to cut this short, it is a very valuable insight into the situation. The U.S. State Department on Monday called out on 2 countries to take in foreign fighters that were helped by America's Kurdish allies in Syria. How realistic is this expectation that the U.S. State Department has of allies, that they will be calling back these ISIS prisoners to their country and then prosecuting them? Is this the only alternative to the solution of what will happen to these prisoners? There are many counts on how many they are, and in some counts are that there are 850 almost in these prisons in Syria.
That's going to be extremely tough because you know that till the end of 2015, many of the Western countries actually let their radicals to leave their country because by this they thought that they're cleaning their own country. They deliberately put a blind eye on their radicals to go to Syria. And now Syria has been turned into a heaven of the foreign fighters, radicals, fundamentalists, which are a danger for the region and for the rest of the world as well. So just calling simply to get the foreign fighters and prosecute them, it's a good wish, it's a wishful thinking, but how to do that? If the USA is coming up with a mechanism and a system that can work, I think Turkey and such regional countries could create a mechanism that could bring an outcome. Otherwise, it will be a wishful thinking because it's too complicated.
It's too complicated, and until there's a proper mechanism in place, of course, this will remain wishful thinking. And thank you so much, Mr. Resul and Mr. Navvar, for your valuable input here on Newswire. It's been a very refreshing and insightful discussion on the plight of what will happen to the security zone as President Erdogan continues to express frustration on the dilly-dallying on part of US forces. And with that, we've come to the end, and we will see you next week. Till then, stay tuned to Indus News.